Welcome to this introduction to corpus linguistics. In this course, we're going to take you through some of the basic concepts in corpus linguistics. We're going to familiarize you with a number of online corpora that you can start using immediately to explore different aspects of the English language. This course is based partly in the second edition of our book, Exploring English with Online Corpora, which was written by Wendy Anderson and me, John Corbett, and published by Harold Macmillan in 2017. Many of the activities we will use are taken from this book. If you want to learn more about the ideas we present in the course, you can search out the book and read it. Equally, if you have already read the book, this online course provides some supplementary commentary on the activities found in it. So, what are we actually going to do in this course? First of all, we'll look at what a corpus is, with examples of a few rather different online corpora. In this session, we will look mainly at issues in corpus design, and we'll start using different kinds of online corpus. In later sessions, we will look at some of the particular search tools that are used in corpus linguistics, like concordances, collocations, and keyword analysis. And we'll explore how corpora, the plural of corpus, are used to explore issues like vocabulary, grammar, discourse, and language variation in English. What then is a corpus? The word corpus, the plural of which, as we've just said, is corpora, originally meant body in Latin, and a linguistic corpus is essentially a body of language. It can be any body of language, but nowadays we assume that a corpus is a large sample of naturally occurring language that is stored electronically in machine-readable format in a computer. And because it's stored electronically, we can design tools to search it quickly and easily. And that's it really. A corpus is a large sample of naturally occurring language, written or spoken, that is stored in the computer and can be searched using different kinds of software. Now, who would be interested in such a corpus? Well, some of the original corpus linguists were interested in gathering evidence for dictionaries. They were lexicographers. Dictionary makers traditionally would compile and edit the data needed for dictionaries. Volunteer readers would read great quantities of written text and send slips of paper to editors who would sift through them, looking for unrecorded words or new senses of recorded words. This process would take decades, even generations. The arrival of computerized corpora changed all that. We can now search for new words and new senses of words very, very quickly using corpora on computers. And we can also notice things that perhaps would not have been noticed before about the meanings of words. To give an example, let's do our first activity together. First of all, consider the following word, seedy. Think about what it means. Pause this recording for a moment while you write down a definition of seedy and the kind of noun that it typically describes, a seedy something. Resume the recording after you've finished. Okay, ready? Now, if you look up seedy in the most authoritative guide to English vocabulary, the Oxford English Dictionary, you'll find that 5 senses are listed for seedy. The 2 main ones are these. 1, A, abounding in seed, full of seed. Seedy, it makes sense. B, it's used to designate the male hop plant. Fine. The second sense is 2A, shabby or ill-looking. And 2B, unwell, poorly, not up to the mark, especially as a result of excessive eating or drinking. The other three meanings given in the Oxford English Dictionary are more specialised, to do with glass blowing, brandy tasting, and wool. Did your definitions and examples correspond with these definitions? Now let's explore this word in a corpus, in this case the 100 million word British National Corpus. First of all, we log on to the BYU BNC interface at the website shown. Then, from the menu bar, we click on List. Now type seedy into the search box and click on Find Matching Strings or simply press Enter. The results show you the number of occurrences of seedy in the 100 million words of the BNC. You'll see that the overall frequency is 115. If you click on the word seedy in the results, you will see some of the contexts of usage. Note down some of the nouns that are modified by seedy, for example, affair, hotel, bars. Think about what these nouns have in common. Now, to compare your results with 520 million words of current American English, go to the COCA corpus and repeat steps 3 to 6. Do you find similar nouns modified by seedy in American English? Now, the results of these searches may confirm your expectations, or they might surprise you. The term seedy derives from the notion of a plant having gone to seed, and out of context it might suggest shabbiness or lack of care. Some of the results of the BNC corpus search confirm such a definition. For example, Harold Macmillan's seedy and stagnant Britain. However, the majority of examples in the BNC suggest something that is sexually unsavoury about the term seedy. For example, seedy affair, seedy porn photos, seedy abortionist, a rake's progress of late nights, seedy bars and relentless beer bellies, the seedy world of prostitution, the filmmaker's seedy little wife, pompously and unseductively nude, seedy northern beauty contest, a seedy image of people who use porn, gave up her seedy career and wrote an expose of the porn business. Now, by no means all the examples in the corpus confirm to this pattern of meaning. There is, for example, an innocent reference to the British actor Will Hayes' creation of the role of a seedy, blustering and ineffectual teacher, and even an instance of the literal sense in seedy grass heads caught in my socks. But many examples do conform to this pattern. These instances are enough to suggest that in contemporary English, the sexually unsavoury component of the meaning of seedy is strong enough to carry into contexts in which it is not necessarily explicitly mentioned. For example, business friends who ran seemingly dowdy or seedy little second-hand enterprises in shops dark and dusty. This sexually unsavoury element of meaning has not yet, however, found its way into the online Oxford English Dictionary, where the closest senses are perhaps shabby or ill as a result of excessive drink. The online Macmillan Dictionary, however, is more clearly informed by corpus data. Here, the main sense given for seedy is connected with activities that are illegal or morally wrong and often looking dirty or unpleasant. At this very basic level then, checking your intuitions and even different dictionary definitions against corpus data can help us to confirm or challenge our preconceptions about words, what they mean and how they're used. We build up our intuitions, of course, from long experience of language read and heard in chronological fashion. We come across instances of words like seedy from time to time, perhaps once in a million words that we read or hear spoken. From each of these instances, we build up an evolving picture of what the word can mean in various contexts. By bringing a substantial number of these contextualized examples together in a corpus, we can become aware of patterns that hitherto remained below the surface of our consciousness. As John Sinclair, one of the pioneers of modern corpus linguistics, once noted, the language looks rather different when you look at a lot of it at once. This then has been one simple illustration of how we can use a corpus to explore language. We'll be doing a lot more of such tasks as the course proceeds. Before we start, however, we need to think about some basic questions about corpus design. We've defined a corpus as a body of naturally occurring language stored in a computer. But can it be any collection of naturally occurring language? If we just download a lot of text from the web, will that be a corpus? And how big does a corpus need to be? Are all corpora the same? Before you start working with a corpus, online or otherwise, you should pay attention to its design. There is an assumption that reliable corpora are not just thrown together at random. Since the first computerized corpora slowly emerged in the 1960s, different kinds of corpora have been developed. Let's consider some of the main types. One of the main distinctions is between a general corpus and a specialized corpus. A general corpus, like the British National Corpus, BNC, or the Corpus of Contemporary American English, COCA, is an attempt to represent the language in its entirety, spoken and written. A specialized corpus, as its name suggests, has the more limited ambition of representing a particular language variety, let's say written journalism, the language used in television soap operas, or parliamentary speeches, or the types of discourses spoken at a university. Specialized corpora include the time corpus of written journalism, the soap corpus of television drama scripts, the Hansard corpus of British parliamentary speeches, and the My Case corpus of the kinds of spoken language recorded at the University of Michigan. The issue of representativeness is important, but tricky. It is possible to make valid generalizations about a language in general, or a specialized language variety, only if the corpus is a fair sample of that language or language variety. Just as no one would claim to be able to make valid conclusions about Singaporean English from analysing a corpus of Scottish English, so we cannot draw valid conclusions about the use of the word like in the spoken language from a corpus which contains only written language, and vice versa. Similarly, we cannot assume that if a grammatical construction is common in a corpus made up of scientific articles, then it's also commonly used in the language more broadly, for example in speech. A representative corpus, then, should be constructed so as to reduce the possibility of making false claims about the language based on partial or skewed data. A word of caution is also necessary here. Corpus linguists talk frequently of the representativeness of corpora, but rarely agree on whether it is even possible to attain perfect representativeness, let alone what would constitute the makeup of this ideal corpus. What are the right proportions of written language and spoken language? How do we deal with the fact that some texts are very widely read or heard over either a long or a short period of time? For example, the Bible, a Queen's speech, a presidential address, the fiction of J.K. Rowling, Agatha Christie or Suzanne Collins, front page newspaper articles, while other texts are read or heard by a few people or in small groups of people. For example, specialised scholarly manuscripts or monographs, horse racing reports, sermons in a small village church. How can we make sure that the voices of people of all ages, genders, occupations, races, religions, types of upbringing and so on are fairly represented in a corpus? So it is tricky. Representativeness can simply be thought of as the inclusion in a corpus of a large number of texts and a large number of registers or genres. Most general corpora will at least try to capture a snapshot of different types of speaking and writing, from casual conversation to painstakingly composed legal documents. If you look at a general corpus, like the Corpus of Contemporary American English, for example, you will see that it draws on different registers of language: spoken, fiction, magazine, newspaper, and academic. This might seem reasonably comprehensive, but think about what's missing. All the language in COCA might be termed public discourse. Even the spoken section of COCA consists of transcribed passages of spontaneous discourse recorded on media programs. What about the sorts of language that are by nature private discourse, personal diaries, intimate conversations, the words you mutter to yourself when you're working through the instructions to build a self-assembly bookcase? Can we justify not including these in a corpus? The British National Corpus has a broader range of spoken genres than COCA, but there are obvious difficulties in obtaining and making public private discourse. Often the corpus designer has to work with what is available and make that as representative as possible. Against general corpora, then, we have specialised corpora, like the Time corpus, which consists entirely of articles taken from Time magazine. Here the corpus designer, Mark Davis, has organised the data into samples from each decade, from the 1920s to the 2000s. This is a corpus entirely made up of written journalism. But because it's spread over 90 years, the time corpus also functions as a diachronic corpus, showing how language changes over time. So let's look at an activity that explores language change in American English, or at least written journalism. Pause the recording and do the second activity. Okay, so let's go through the activity together. We're looking at language change over time, the time corpus of American journalism. To recap, at the Brigham Young University website, there is a 100 million word corpus of articles from Time magazine from the 1920s through the 2000s. It's a diachronic corpus of American journalistic prose, and it's good for showing us how language changes in that century. So the time corpus can be used to explore linguistic and cultural questions, and the one that we're going to look at is, when was the foreign morpheme nick introduced to US English? When did it become popular? What was the range of its uses in journalistic texts? How did that range of uses change over time? And what are its meanings in English, and did those meanings change over time? Okay, let's go over the activity together. I've asked you to go to the Brigham Young University website and choose the time corpus. And I've asked you to put in the search item *NIK. This is known as a wildcard search. You'll get every word that ends with NIK. If you want the plural, you can put in *NIK*, and that will get you nick and nicks. I've asked you to click on the chart. The chart results show you the frequency of nick items, decade by decade. And you can ask yourself, are they as you predicted? Or is the use of nick being sustained, or is it declining? If you want more detail, you can click on the bar representing any decade. You'll then see the results for each decade in the area below the chart. You'll have to dismiss what we might call noise, for example, personal names that include nick at the end of them. But for the remaining words, you can ask, is there a pattern of meaning for those words that include nick as a diminutive suffix? And then you can repeat this kind of search to see if there are similar patterns for other borrowings into English, like ista, barista, fashionista, for example. Let's go over this one more time just to make sure that you're comfortable with it. I've asked you to find the time corpus from the Brigham Young University website and put in, let's say, *NIK, and that'll give you the singular form of all words that end with NIK. If you click on chart and see frequency by section, these are the results that you'll get. And you can see that from a fairly modest number of occurrences in the first half of the century, there's a big leap in the number of nick suffixes in the 1950s, and then it slowly tapers off in the decades that follow. Okay, so let's take a look at the results in more detail. If you sample the first 100 or so occurrences in each decade, then the following patterns should become evident. In the data from the 1920s to the 1940s, we mainly see personal names with a few direct borrowings from Russian. For example, udarnik, a highly productive shock brigade worker, or voyentechnik, technician. And you might be aware that nik is in fact a Russian suffix meaning little. It's used in nicknames of people who exemplify a particular kind of quality too. In the 1950s, the diminutive continues to be used in proper names and in nicknames like Loverboynik, referring to the then popular entertainer Liberace, who was presumably considered to exemplify the quality of being a lover boy. The suffix still seems to suggest a diminutive quality, possibly rather dismissive. Then in 1957, an event of global cultural and political significance happens. The Soviet Union, as was, launches the first artificial satellite into space. In Russian, it's called Little Moon or Sputnik. Not surprisingly, the word Sputnik is very frequently used in written journalism and is probably disproportionately frequent in the time corpus. If we continue looking at the data, in the 1960s, Sputnik is still in the news, but there are new words also using this diminutive in English. Beatnik, pre-beatnik, sicknik comedians, sugar beatnik, goatnik, the supreme courtnik, bleatnik. By the end of the 1960s, an era of social revolution in America, the suffix "nick" has come to be associated with a sense of alternative lifestyles and alternative, possibly communist values, or it can mean some kind of fanatic. In the 1970s, the use of the suffix is declining. Beatnik survives, but it's still joined by a few others like kibbutznik and refusnik. In the 1980s to the 2000s, the suffix is mainly used with personal names again, but there are still a few more coinages. For example, no-goodnik, peacenik, greenpeacenik. To sum up, the specialised time corpus can show us something that was practically impossible to track before the era of corpus linguistics, that is, language change as influenced by social events like the launch of a satellite during the space race. The time corpus suggests that the Russian suffix "nik" was available in American English for satiric use, for example, in the early 1950s, but that it was the launch of Sputnik that popularised the diminutive from the late 1950s on. The 1960s saw most coinages being generated, usually to denote someone bohemian or subversive in an era of social unrest and changing values. The 1970s on show the survival of the main coinages, for example beatnik, and the arrival of some new ones, but it seems that the generative power of the suffix is fading. Although it's quite a specific example, this illustration, the illustration "nick", can tell us something more about the English language in general. Its tendency to adopt certain foreign grammatical markers and then use them to indicate an attitude, often a negative attitude. A very similar process to the suffix "nick" is currently happening with the suffix "ista". You might wish to track the growth of this suffix yourself in time and also in the more general coca corpus. So far then we've been looking at general and more specialised corpora. The specialised time corpus is also an example of a diachronic corpus. It samples language over time, so we can see how language change operates here within the specialised domain of written journalism. A more general diachronic corpus is the corpus of historical American English, which looks at written American English from 1810 to the 2000s. Its registers are fiction, magazines, newspapers and other non-fiction. Obviously, a diachronic corpus that extends beyond the 20th century has limited access to spoken data, and again, COHA, the Corpus of Historical American English, focuses on public discourse. But within its constraints, it can still claim to be more representative of broader language use than time is, and it is more diachronic than the original British National Corpus, which only collected data from the 1980s and 1990s. The BNC then can be considered a synchronic corpus in that its snapshot of the language is restricted to a short space of time, a couple of decades. The original British National Corpus, it is presently being updated, can also be considered a static corpus. Up until now being 2017, it has not changed. The corpus of contemporary American English does, however, change. Periodically, 20 million more words are added for each year. The corpus therefore keeps growing, but the design of the corpus is kept constant, and so it can be considered what is called a monitor corpus. It tracks the language as it changes and it is kept up to date. For those who want to be kept abreast of very recent language change, another monitor corpus is the new Now corpus, News on the Web, NOW. It currently contains about 3 billion words of data, but the register is very restricted, it's very specialised. It's a register of online journalism. The distinctive feature of this corpus is that it increases by about 4 to 5 million words every day. So it's a monitor corpus, but it's more specialised than COCA. A question that you might reasonably ask then is how big should a corpus be? The issue of size is a separate but related issue to that of representativeness. If you want to make a dictionary, it's important that your corpus should be large, usually tens, if not hundreds of millions of words in size. O'Keefe, McCarthy and Carter observed that to obtain a sufficient range of prepositions to follow the word bargain, they needed to search a corpus of about 10 million words. And they go on to state, in terms of what constitutes a large or a small corpus, it depends on whether it's a spoken or a written corpus and what it's seeking to represent. For corpora of the spoken language, anything over 1 million words is considered to be large. For written corpora, anything below 5 million is quite small. Even so, A lot of interesting research can be done on the more frequent or core words, the core constructions and the core features of a language, with corpora of even a few tens of thousands of words. Size, along with design, is a feature of a corpus which should suit the purpose to which it is put. In the context of corpora for language learning, for example, Chambers notes that it is clear that, despite the corpus linguists' need for corpora to be as large as possible in support of the researcher's quest for the elusive quality of representativity, several of those who focus on classroom applications and who have experience of working with learners have become aware of the usefulness of the small corpus. Small corpora are particularly useful if you're looking at frequently occurring features, for example, some common grammatical features in a particular language variety, such as business reports or classroom discourse. In this kind of case, a corpus does not need to be huge. Even so, several online corpora are very large indeed. We've already mentioned the Mega Now corpus, and the global web-based English corpus, GLOWBE, also has 1.9 billion words at the time of recording, probably way more now. While access to a large corpus is often preferable, because there's a common assumption that the bigger the corpus, the more reliable it is, particularly for those less frequent features of a language, it's more important to have a good understanding not just of the size, but of the design of the corpus being used, and therefore the level of confidence which one can have in findings from it. And of course, a lot also depends on the questions you want the corpus to answer. The questions that we want to ask are indeed vital to the decisions that we make about what kind of corpus to use. Do we want to look at some aspect of British or American English, or Scottish, or Canadian, or Australian, or Hong Kong, or Singaporean, or another world variety? Does the corpus claim to be representative? Does it include public and private discourse, and written and spoken English? What is the proportion of each register in the corpus? What are the principles of data collection and organisation that were used in the corpus design? Are we interested in language use at a particular period of time in the past? We can use a completed, static corpus to investigate that period. Or do we want to find out how language is being used right now? Do we, like dictionary editors, really need a monitor corpus to track language change over time? There are kinds of specialist corpora that are particularly popular with different kinds of scholar. Applied linguists are interested in developing learner corpora of second language learners' written or spoken language. How do learners of English whose first language is, let's say, Chinese or German, write and speak English? Are there developmental patterns similar to each other or different from each other? Can we compare the performance of low-level learners with more proficient learners? What's changed in between? Learner corpora can also be compared with native speaker corpora. Finally, translation scholars are interested in two types of corpora, parallel and comparable corpora. Although the terminology varies, a parallel corpus is generally taken to be one which contains texts in translation, while a comparable corpus contains texts which are not translated, but which are functionally equivalent in two or more languages. So a collection of translations of books by the same novelist would, by this definition, constitute a parallel corpus, while a collection of original, not translated, newspaper articles in different languages about the same or similar topics would constitute a comparable corpus. Translation scholars are interested in finding out if in the process of translation the source language exerts an influence on the target language. And by combining an exploration of parallel and comparable corpora, they can determine if this is or is not happening. We've covered a lot of ground in this session. By now, if someone were to approach you, let's say in the street, and ask you, you should be able to answer the following questions. What is a corpus? How do linguists use corpora to explore the meanings of a word, or let's say the uses of a borrowed grammatical suffix over time? In what ways are the following types of corpus distinct from each other? A general versus a specialized corpus? A static versus a monitor corpus? Synchronic versus diachronic corpora? A learner versus a native speaker corpus? And parallel versus comparable corpora? What makes a corpus representative? Do all corpora need to be big? When are small corpora useful? If you're confident that you can answer these questions, you're ready to progress to the second session. Thanks for listening.